Thank you very much for having me. My name is Rajlakshmi, but feel free to call me Raj. And we've had several speakers today reference the role of China and call it things like the China factor and how that's really changing the landscape in development today. So I wanted to go a little bit deeper into that for my project. So this is a picture of Thika Highway in Kenya, and it's an infrastructure project that China spent $100 million on. It's an 8-lane highway in Kenya that connects sort of the center of Nairobi to outer areas, and it cost $100 million, and it was contracted by 3 Chinese construction companies that employed about 4,000 Chinese workers. So I just wanted to start off with an example of what that looks like. A bit more background on the issue. The landscape has really been changing in about the last decade. So within the last few years, the amount of aid coming from Western countries into Africa is on the decreasing trend, whereas the amount of aid coming from other developing countries like China's is increasing rapidly. So from 2000 to 2011, it's estimated that China committed over $75 billion in official finance to Africa. And so I guess the question then is, how do you interpret this increasing competition? Because you now have aid both coming from Western countries, the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD nations, and then you also now have the option of aid from other emerging countries like China or Brazil. And so in a way, it's sort of creating a market for aid. It's increasing the competition between donors themselves. So as a recipient nation, now you can almost view it as being able to shop around. So which package better fits my needs. And so of course that's the point of controversy, is whether having this new availability of aid donation from China, is that good or bad? And a lot of the sentiment from the existing aid structures in Western countries are concerned about it, and a lot of times there will be tension between the official development assistance committee and then these non-official sources like China. And a lot of it boils down to transparency as well. So at a conference in 2011 in South Korea for aid effectiveness, it sort of split along those lines of ODA, official development assistance, versus these other sources. And countries like China argued that, well, we're like a separate South-South partnership, and why should we have to abide by the same structures and the same institutions as people in a North-South partnership, like we're a separate entity. And in terms of what that can look like in terms of how it might be different, the biggest deal so far was signed in 2010 between Ghana and China, and it was a $6 billion infrastructure and health investment in Ghana, and in return, it was supported by crude oil. So for every day for 15 years, Ghana is going to give 13,000 barrels of crude oil to China. So I think what's clear is that it's sort of a business transaction. It's now becoming more about choice in terms of what are the options in terms of where I can get foreign aid. And so I want to delve a bit more into the different hypotheses about whether this is a positive change or whether it's something to be worried about. So, like I said, some of the criticism is coming from Western countries. Here's an example from the former editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy, and he says, rogue donors couldn't care less about the long-term well-being of the population of the countries they aid. And Hillary Clinton also sort of takes a stab at it by saying that, well, America's committed to democracy and human rights in Africa, even when it might be easier or more profitable to look the other way to keep the resources flowing. But on the other hand, there's a lot of positive support and a lot of people who think that this is bringing about really positive changes and it should be encouraged. So the former president of Senegal was giving an example about how a contract that would take 5 years to discuss and negotiate with the World Bank would only take 3 months when you deal with Chinese authorities, that it's more efficient and that in the long run it's building really needed infrastructure projects like roads and schools and hospitals. It's doing so efficiently, so it should be encouraged. So for my project, when I started to read about the issues, what I really found is that it's a debate that's steeped right now in theoretical arguments and sort of one side arguing against the other, and there's a complete lack of data-driven studies or empirical work in this area. So I wanted to take a look at it from a data perspective, which I'll talk about, but that's only becoming possible like recently due to advancements in data. But before I could really look at it empirically, I had the sort of the challenge of how do I shape this question in terms of different hypotheses, because it's such a big question to try to answer. What could be the motivation in China's minds? What are the different incentives for them? And so I split it up into 4 hypotheses to test, four conceptual hypotheses so that I can then test them each using data. So the first one is probably the most obvious choice, and that's the raw materials hypothesis. That because China is such a big manufacturing economy with a huge population and not like a huge supply of their own internal resources, that this is motivated because they want to get better access to raw materials. So I look at things like oil reserves and iron production, copper, and since lumber is also a really needed raw material, I also look at forested area. The second hypothesis that I'm interested in looking at is the issue of soft power. So soft power is the opposite of military strength. It has to do more with political relations. So as a country, how much can you gain from your network with other countries? So like with the U.S., like they have a very strong alliance with Europe, whereas China is sort of, despite their economic success, they're still sort of lacking that soft power, and so maybe Africa is a place for them to gain that, and maybe that's what they're somewhat driven by. And here's a picture of the president of Nigeria with the president of China. And so in order to look at soft power, I was trying to understand if maybe there would be some sort of relationship between a country's level of corruption or whether they have like a healthy level of opposition represented in their elections. So what's the political landscape of the countries that Africa is aiding? The third hypothesis that I came up with is the emerging markets investment. So because a lot of aid is loans and because a lot of it is sort of a long-term investment in a country, I thought maybe one thing that could be driving China, not just about getting raw materials, but more holistically about investing in countries that are going to be the future of economic growth, so like future emerging markets. So things that would be important are things like GDP and GDP growth rate, if a country's exporting a lot. I thought imports would also be important to look at if a country is importing a lot, and possibly a lot of those imports would be coming from China. And then as well, the government's surplus or deficit. Is it going to be a country that can repay the loan, or is it more likely to not be able to repay that? And then the fourth hypothesis, I guess it's not so much of what I think would be driving China's involvement, but it's an important thing to consider is are the areas that need aid the most, are they the ones also getting it? So infrastructural need, in terms of a country's inequality, in terms of a country's poverty, extreme poverty levels, what proportion of the population is living under extreme poverty. Because I think anytime you're analyzing aid allocation, it's always good to look at like who's actually getting the aid. Is it going to needy regions or not? Okay, so in terms of data, this project, like I said, I want it to be empirical, which is very difficult when you're studying, and this came up during the lunch talk, that data from about Chinese official aid flows is not something that's readily available. China doesn't release official aid statistics, and like I said, that's part of the tension between like the official ODA assistance and then these other countries, is that they're just not under the same reporting systems. There may be political reasons for why it's not reported. As well as like the Chinese aid structure is a bit more fragmented, so it's not all coming from the same things. But within the last year, there's been an effort to get more open access data about Chinese aid projects. And I really recommend the website aiddata.org for any like researcher working with aid projects. So this website is collaboration through BYU and William and Mary, and their goal is to have better, more detailed information about aid projects, not just Chinese aid, but other types of aid. I actually used their data for another project I did as well, where they had geocoded every single project in Malawi, so I was able to do like a really specific project level analysis using their stuff. And then, like I said, within the last year, they've made an effort to get better transparency about Chinese aid projects in Africa. So it's on the country level. It's not like very specifically geocoded, but they do have project level data for every country from 2000 to 2011. And the way they were able to compile it was to use media-based data collection methodology, where they collected thousands of media reports, because like from China, and basically used that to code what the project is, where it is, how much aid is being received. Because like I think it was mentioned at the lunch talk, like people in Africa know about these aid projects. Like it's not a big secret. It's lacking sort of the official statistics, but you can track it through the media. So in terms of modeling each hypothesis, I ended up not using a regular ordinary least squares, because anytime you have cost data, you'll have a lot of observations that are zeros, because you have certain countries in certain years that just don't receive any projects, and you have like a lot of right skewness. So there's something called a generalized linear model that's just much better when you don't meet those assumptions of your errors being sort of normally distributed. Okay, so I want to start going into the actual results of what I found when I tested these 4 hypotheses. And I definitely had a lot of questions about what is the best way to test them. So I tried a few different things. The first thing that we're looking at in testing the raw materials hypothesis is what happens when you look at these variables of interest, things like how much oil does a country have and how much iron do they produce, and what happens when you just consider those individually without controlling for any other factors. Do you see a significant trend? And the answer with Chinese aid is you don't really see any strong trends. You don't really see disproportionate amounts of aid going to different countries due to any of these things. Well, you do get some significance for the amount of forested area, but it's actually negatively correlated. So if you're not controlling for anything, countries with less forested area are actually getting more aid. And of course, this is controlling for nothing. So then I tried a more holistic approach of what happens when you start controlling for things like country trends, time trends, as well as controlling for these other factors. And then you do find that iron production significantly and positively predicts the amount of Chinese aid received. And then when I started to try to interpret these results, I realized that it's not as interesting to ask the question of how do you predict Chinese aid if you're not even comparing it to official development assistance. So I started to run these same models on the official development assistance being received from Western nations. So how does their model compare? In terms of raw materials, when you're just considering them separately, it's also not very illustrative that the resources are going to or that the aid is going to high resource countries. If anything, most of the coefficients are negative. So ODA is going to non-resource rich countries. When you control for everything, you actually, for ODA, you see a positive relationship with the amount of oil reserves. So I thought that was surprising because you don't see that for China. So you see oil being a stronger predictor for non-Chinese aid than for Chinese aid. So I guess my overall takeaway for hypothesis 1 was that I wasn't able to find any strong empirical evidence for the raw materials hypothesis. I mean, you do see the positive coefficient for iron, but it wasn't all across the board that resources were explaining Chinese aid. So I'll go a little faster. So for the second hypothesis of soft power, again, looking at is China going to be somehow motivated by getting more political prowess in these countries? And I looked at two variables. I looked at levels of corruption, I used data from Transparency International, where they have every year they have an index published about perceived corruption in every country. And I also looked at whether there's a level of opposition in elections, is the opposition party participating for elections? And what you find when you control for everything is that they do both matter pretty significantly. It was confusing to interpret it, though, because it's looking like countries that are less corrupt on the margin get more aid, but then countries that have a healthy level of opposition get less aid. So those almost seemed a bit contradictory to me, but it might have to do with countries that are sort of on the in-between, that don't have a lot of opposition participating, but are somehow perceived to not be very corrupt. In terms of the ODA picture, it's very different. So nothing mattered when you just looked at official development assistance. These variables were not explanatory at all. And in testing soft power, what I started to realize was that it's just a really difficult question to look at hypothesis number 2 with data, because if that hypothesis were true, that China is really interested in gaining this political rapport, then what would that even look like? What countries would be targeted? Would you target countries that are perceived as corrupt, or would you target countries that have better governance systems? So I started to realize that, though I do want to look at it from a data perspective, that hypothesis is pretty hard to test. And there's a lot of research that shows, aid effectiveness is contingent on having strong policies. So there's almost sort of this reverse thing going on, that maybe they're getting aid because they have good governance, and not that that's what would be motivating China. In terms of the emerging markets hypothesis, when I control for everything, I find that having a higher GDP and having a lot of exports are positively predicting Chinese aid. So it's sort of this idea that a stronger economy maybe is more likely to repay the loans, or maybe it's going to be a good long-term investment. From the ODA perspective, it's kind of the opposite. So exports negatively predict getting aid, and imports positively predict it. So very different pictures between Chinese aid and official aid for that hypothesis. And for the last one, and I've seen this result in other projects where I've looked at aid as well, that for some reason, whenever you try to see if it's going to places that need it the most, you always get the opposite result. So you get that it's going to places that are more unequal, and that having poverty reduces aid. So sort of the opposite results of what you'd hope to see. And so that does show up in Chinese aid. It shows up in ODA as well if you look at them separately, but if you control for everything, then neither of these matter in ODA. I think I'm running out of time, but the last step of this project is to sort of consider everything together, because each of those are run separately, but what happens if you compare all hypotheses in the same regression? Do some cancel each other out? What ends up still being very robust and significant? And the answer is that the individual hypotheses, the results from before, are still pretty robust when you consider them together. So I'd say the natural resource hypothesis, you still don't see a lot of support for that. You just see the iron being positive and significant, but it's economically pretty small. You still see those political variables mattering a lot, but like I said, those are harder to interpret as to what that means. GDP still matters, and then finally, things like inequality and poverty still explain it pretty well, but they explain it in the direction opposite of what you'd like to see. And the same thing's true for ODA. It's pretty robust to, including everything together. You still see that the natural resources almost explain ODA better than they explain Chinese aid, and sort of the opposite of the economic health indicators. GDP decreases, ODA exports decrease it, and imports increase it. So I'd say, I know there was like a lot of different models that I was running, but in terms of wrapping it up, I wouldn't say that any of the hypotheses had very, very strong data evidence. I wouldn't say that. I would say that hypothesis 4, you can reject that. Places that maybe need infrastructure the most, that's not happening. But in terms of hypothesis 1 through 3 about raw materials and about political soft power and overall economic strength, all of them had some variables that mattered, but I don't think any of them clearly explained the picture in a way that made the other hypotheses not matter. So that could mean either these hypotheses are all working together, like there's some truth in all of them, or that it could also be an econometric issue, because obviously there may be issues with data quality, with sample size. Like there's 50 African countries being included for 12 years. That's not a huge sample. And also I think the last thing is that it also illustrates sort of the difficulty of testing these types of hypotheses using empirical work. I think it's very important, and that's why I wanted to try, but defining benchmarks through which to test these, I think is definitely a challenge. Thank you.